Hello friends, I welcome you today in Unique Academy's YouTube channel. We have a series of lectures. We have organized series of lectures on discussion of syllabus of UPSC, and in that series of lectures, one by one, different faculties, senior faculties and my colleagues would be discussing different parts of syllabus of UPSC Civil Services. Here in today's session, we will be discussing General Studies Paper 2, and being more particular, we will be talking about only Indian polity, governance and constitution related part, which also includes development processes and development industries. So dear friends, what is there in discussion of syllabus? Why do we need to discuss syllabus? Why do we need to know the syllabus? At the first place, UPSC has given in detail different topics under 4 papers of GS, as you all must be knowing. So here it is important to understand that we need to stick to the syllabus of UPSC, and we need to take hold over the syllabus. We need to understand different expectations of UPSC through syllabus, of course, in addition to that through previous year question papers. But unless and until one is acquainted with what syllabus is, what different points are prescribed by UPSC, till then the preparation remains incomplete or would be haywire, will not be in the said bracket of the syllabus itself. So that is the reason why we decided here in Unique Academy that we should let you all know what different topics of what different topics have been prescribed by UPSC, and we will go into details of those topics. Of course, as you must be knowing that going through each and every topic in thorough details would be very difficult. So in today's session, we will just have a sort of a brief introduction and brief idea or outline of UPSC's General Studies Paper 2 syllabus. So dear friends, let's start with the same. And my name is Pravin Patil. I have been associated with the Unique Academy for last 16-17 years and have been consistently teaching since then. I have been engaging lectures on GS2, particularly Indian polity, constitution and governance. So let's begin with the first part here, and we will talk about these different components of GS Paper 2 syllabus. So GS Paper 2, if you all know, includes 2 important parts. First, it talks about general part of Indian constitution and polity, and second, it includes IR, international relations. So far as this part of syllabus is concerned, there will be a faculty, and that separate faculty would be discussing this particular part and syllabus of IR. Today's our interest is basically Indian constitution, polity and governance. So accordingly, I have divided the GS2 syllabus into 4 to 5 basic components, as you can see. So first is an introduction to paper 2. Then we will talk about Indian constitution and different components of Indian constitution. Then, for the sake of convenience, actually this has been done. So then we have governance and concepts related to governance. Then there is a topic called as social justice, which we will discuss. And also, along with social justice, then we will also discuss about development processes. So this is a very brief idea or brief outline of what GS Paper 2 prescribes as a part of syllabus. So friends, let's now go into details of each one of these one by one. If you now look at the first part, the Indian Constitution, under this particular part of our syllabus, UPSC expects us to prepare on these topics. So let's look at these topics, and in brief, let's also understand, the meaning of these topics. So first point for us is historical underpinnings. Now, what do you mean by historical underpinnings? What is expected under this particular topic? Underpinnings term actually expects us to go into details of history of Indian Constitution, right? Then its framing, different components of Indian Constitution which may have some historical base or which may have some historical context, and that historical context here is necessary to be studied in detail when we talk about historical underpinnings of Indian Constitution. Let's take an example of this just for the sake of understanding. So if we look at Indian Constitution and the way ultimately it came to be framed and came into existence, you know that Indian Constitution is preceded by a long drawn struggle of India's independence, and all that struggle of India's independence basically is a process through which different values, were practiced by constitution makers, or for that matter, the leaders of India's freedom struggle. And those values ultimately you will find are, are mentioned in Indian Constitution in different forms, in technical forms at times. And of course, like if you read the preamble of the Indian Constitution, you definitely get to know that these values are practiced in India's freedom struggle also. Apart from that, one of the famous examples which I can quote here is basically of Government of India Act 1935, and it has been said that most of Indian Constitution has been borrowed from Government of India Act 1935. So when we talk about historical underpinnings, I just cited one example of Government of India Act 1935, but when we talk about historical underpinnings, we have to probably go into details of all such different legislations passed by British Parliament and which have sort of a impact on India's constitution, its framing, and its ultimate structure. So in brief, that I can say about historical underpinnings. Now, it is interesting that after historical underpinnings, your syllabus in paper 2, UPSC also makes a mention of something called as evolution. Now, the question comes like, how is the evolution and historical underpinnings are different? Like, what is the difference between these two words? So, dear friends, we can definitely go back to understand India's constitutional evolution. If we want to go back, prior to India's independence, we can definitely go back. But then that particular part is sort of covered here in first particular point. Now, under evolution, we must essentially trace the history of India's growth or constitutional growth. How has Indian Constitution grown after 1947, or maybe 26th of January being more particular, 26th of January 1950. So, how has been the process of India's constitution and constitutional evolution? So this essentially involves, if we want to merge topics, then this different amendments which have been enacted till date, can be added into the way it has evolved. Evolution also essentially involves the fact that Supreme Court of India on number of occasions have interpreted Indian Constitution and interpreted its silences and have contributed in its evolution. One of the best example that can be authoritatively cited here to justify or to sort of substantiate evolution is basically basic structure, which has recently last year, which has completed its 50 years of existence, right? So evolution basically includes the way Indian Constitution has evolved or has progressed after 26th of January 1950 till date. Now, friends, after evolution, what we have under topic under this particular topic is features, different features of Indian Constitution. Now, again comes a question like, what do you mean by features? And if you look at this particular point, significant provisions, right? These two things there is a sort of a minute difference between these two things. So far as features are concerned, when we talk about features, we are talking about whether it is written constitution or not, right? It is lengthy or it is bulky or it is very short or whatever. So basically features talk about, or basically features of Indian Constitution, or UPSC expects us to have a brief idea about what different characteristics of our constitution are, whether it is unitary, whether it is federal, whether it is centralized, right? You must all be knowing that Indian Constitution is referred to as the lengthiest written constitution in the world. Now, that is basically a feature of Indian Constitution. So, in this fashion, we will have to take into consideration different features, but simultaneously, I would like to club these features with significant provisions of the Constitution. Now, when we look at significant provisions of Indian Constitution, we can take an example. The most significant, I would say, or maybe one of the most significant features of Indian Constitution, I would say, is 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment, which brings democracy to the grassroots, which makes Indian constitution more vocal at the grassroots. So that is one of the significant provisions. Along with that, I can definitely cite few more examples. Like if we talk about, this would become little technical. However, if we take an example of Article 249, right? This particular article is not found in anywhere in other constitutions of the world. This seems to be a unique feature of Indian Constitution. Apart from that, if we take a reference to Part 18 of the Constitution, which talks about emergency provisions, right? So though it is mentioned in some other constitutions of the world, however, emergency provisions, the way they operate under Indian Constitution, are really very significant, and you will understand that there is a sort of speciality, there is a sort of uniqueness which Part 18 of the Constitution reflects. Along with that, you must also be knowing about Part 21 of the Constitution. This should be, ideally speaking, written in Roman. However, I have, for the sake of convenience, I am writing it in ordinary numbers. So basically, when we talk about Part 21 of the Constitution, which has been recently in news, which imparts sort of asymmetry to India's federalism, right? You must be knowing Article 370, Article 371, and some other provisions of Indian Constitution, which carries this accommodative feature, or which carries this accommodative tool, right, to accommodate diversity of India. So such provisions under Indian Constitution becomes, or can be called as, significant provisions, right, which you or one needs to study while studying significant provisions of Indian Constitution. Apart from that, when we turn our attention to the next topic, and that is basic structure. Now, as I have rightly pointed out a while ago, that in evolution itself, Keshwananda Bharati versus State of Kerala has been a landmark judgment of the court, of the Supreme Court, Honorable Supreme Court, and that judgment also contributed in evolution of Constitution, and the outcome of that judgment is nothing but basic structure principle or basic structure doctrine. Now, let's look at it very brief. I just said that in 2023, basic structure doctrine completed its 50 years of existence. So basically 24th of April 1973, basic structure doctrine was propounded by Supreme Court, and that basic structure doctrine is here for our study. And as has been rightly said, it is there to stay for long. So what is basic structure? Basic structure is ideally foundational, fundamental values on the basis of which, or on which we have constructed constitutional architecture, or we have constructed constitutional design. So complete design of a constitution is based on some fundamental values like equality, like fundamental rights or liberty or freedom, for that matter, federalism, democracy, so on and so forth. So when we talk about basic structure, or when we are going to discuss basic structure, or maybe when we are going to study basic structure, what one needs to do is one needs to understand the purpose behind invoking this particular idea or evolving this particular idea of basic structure, by Supreme Court of India. And that basic structure has definitely helped us, on many occasions, wherein whether it is idea of separation of powers, or whether it is protection of fundamental rights of individuals, or protection of independence of any organization, or maybe any organ of the state, so on and so forth. So basic structure that way appears to be one of the most important factors, which one needs to study in introductory part of Indian Constitution itself. So this again, in my opinion, is an important aspect or important part. Let's now move to the next part, and that is comparison scheme with other countries. Now, it is very interesting that UPSC has mentioned that the aspirants, those who are preparing for this particular exam, civil service exam, they need to know at the first place, if we take this example or these points, if we refer to these points, they need to first know what Indian Constitution is. And then along with that, they also need to know at least some of the major constitutions of the world. However, not complete constitutions, I would say, but rather important provisions of Indian Constitution, which resemble with important provisions of other constitutions. For example, just for the sake of example, if we talk about basic structure of Indian Constitution, as we were discussing right now, this basic structure has been a very profound and very significant invention rather, I would say, of Supreme Court of India, which has been well received across the globe. Multiple countries have and their Supreme Courts have referred to that judgment and have searched for the same. To cite an example, I should definitely refer to Canadian Supreme Court, which made a mention in 2022, if I'm not wrong, which observed basically that some of the unwritten principles of Canadian Constitution cannot be amended by the Canadian Parliament or maybe Canadian Central Legislature. So that is basically, that particular judgment was based on this idea of basic structure. So what we need to do here, that when we compare Indian Constitution, right, is it that the aspirant needs to know all the provisions of all the constitutions of the world? Obviously not. That is definitely not required. Then how should we prepare for this topic, and what is expected here? It is expected that you follow newspaper, and in news, when you come across some event that is taking place, say in some other country which has some resemblance with Indian Constitution or Indian context, in that case you may come across a question on that particular part in mains. For example, last presidential election which took place in India, right, simultaneously in France also presidential elections were going on, right? And so what UPSC did is UPSC asked about comparison between Indian presidential office and terms and conditions of that office with that of French president and terms and conditions of French presidential office. So that's how, one needs to prepare for this. So friends, so far as this particular point is concerned, and syllabus to this particular comparison with different countries and their constitutional scheme is concerned, one needs to be really very keen observer about what is going on in newspaper, whether there is something that we need to read from other jurisdictions which we can compare with that of Indian Constitution. So on the first slide, we have got these, on first part you can say, we have got these many points which we need to prepare for. So I have briefly sort of, tried to explain the same, and we will now move to the next slide. So next slide here talks about union and state. So when we look at this particular slide and syllabus here, there are two words here. So we have union and states. So what does this mean? These are two different words, right? So states you all are aware about. These are basically regional governments, right? Whereas when we talk about union, it is central government. However, the term central government doesn't appear in the constitution, and so we have these two words, union and state. Now, when it comes to union and state, what do we need to do? In what reference do we need to study this? So these are the referring points here for us. So let's go and understand, let's try and understand these points also. So it is expected that one who is studying, should study the union and states functions, responsibilities, issues and challenges pertaining to something. So union government and state government have been, union government and state governments have been allotted some functions under constitution, some responsibilities under constitution, and some powers also under constitution. And out of this arrangement in constitution, right, which separately recognizes state government, which separately recognizes union government, out of this arrangement, out of their exercising powers and executing their functions and responsibilities, some issues may arise, some challenges these governments or these two levels of governments may face. So what challenges and what issues do we need to prepare for? In what context? So as has been rightly pointed out here in the syllabus, one needs to prepare for federal structure. Any issues or challenges that may arise out of, issues and challenges which may arise out of the federal structure. So what basically do you mean by federal structure? Basically, federal structure is nothing but union and state governments, two parallel level of government. So one is at national level and second is at regional level, right? So these two layers of government, these two bodies or maybe a bunch of bodies at two different levels, that is national and regional level, they keep working for people, they keep working for their territory, their jurisdictions, and while doing so, while executing their functions, they may clash with each other at times, they may cooperate with each other, they may argue against each other, and accordingly multiple issues may arise. One of the recent issues which I would like to cite here is Kerala, government of Kerala and government of center, not agreeing on issues pertaining to release of funds, right? And then that issue is basically federal issue, though being more particular, fiscal federalism issue pertains to fiscal federalism. But in similar manner, there can be multiple such issues which may arise out of this arrangement under constitution. Now, one needs to prepare, thoroughly for issues and challenges which we are facing as of now, because of, or maybe we are facing as of now for federalism or federal structure. You probably must be knowing post GST and post Corona or post lockdown, states have been demanding more of the resources from the center, and center also promised it to the states that we will give the same. And then there have been recently number of issues arising out of it. So that's the point here which we need to prepare for when it comes to federal structure. So when center and state are working for same people, and also working on a same territory, they come into contact, there is a sort of interdependence between center and state, or maybe union and state, and that interdependence at times functions really in a healthy manner, and at times there are some disturbances. So if it functions in a healthy manner, still we need to prepare, or maybe we need to focus and study for the same. And when there are challenges or some difficulties arising out of it, then also we need to prepare for the same, right? In similar manner, there are some challenges and issues arising out of devolution of powers and finances up to local levels. It is next point that we need to pay an attention to. Here I said that there is one government that is national government, then we have second layer that is regional government, and then we have third layer that we created in recent past 3 decades ago, and that is local government, a very unique feature of Indian constitution. Now this local government, when we created out of 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments, there came an issue. There was an issue, and what is that? How and to what extent the devolution of power should take place up to local levels. We created this as a third tier of governance, and not just of a governance, but also of a democracy. We wanted that at local level, similarly at national, and the way we have at national and regional level, we wanted to create a sort of a mirror image of democratic functioning at local level, and for that we created a structure under 73rd and 74th amendment, and that structure is essentially of panchayat institutions and municipalities and municipal corporations and bodies of the same sort. So when it comes to creating such structure at local level, we need to think about powers and finances and devolution of powers and finances up to local level. So after around 3 decades of creating local self-government bodies, we are still dealing with, or we are still heavily concerned about to what extent the powers and finances to be devoluted to local level, so that they can function as agencies of self-governance rather than functioning as agents of center or state governments for that matter. So we need to prepare these 2 topics also under this particular point. The next point in the syllabus is separation of powers. Separation of powers between various organs of the state. Then dispute redressal mechanism and different institutions. Now what comes into our mind while we read this, or while we are preparing for this, is what do you mean by separate organs or various organs of the state? So it is very simple that at least most of you must be knowing about legislature. At national level it is called as parliament. Then we have judiciary. At national level it is known as Supreme Court of India, the Honorable Supreme Court of India, and then there is something called as executives. At national level, it is called as President and his Council and Prime Minister. right? In similar manner, we have similar type of arrangement at state level also, wherein the state legislature is named or referred to as State Legislative Council and State Legislative Assembly. In most of the states, we have State Legislative Assembly, so that is legislature. And judiciary at state level is basically honorable high courts across different states in India, and executive at state level is honorable governor of a respective states, along with the chief ministers and their councils. So when we look at separation of powers, we need to prepare for the way Indian Constitution has divided power and responsibilities and functions between at least these three major organs of the state, right? And apart from that also, we can definitely extend the idea of separation of power to other organs also, or maybe other institutions under Constitution. However, for the sake of today's discussion, we should keep it only to these three organs: the lawmaking body, the adjudicating body, and the executing body, or you can say administrative body. So under separation of powers, we need to prepare for this particular thing. Apart from that, this particular arrangement, under Indian Constitution, further creates some issues like legislature judiciary, executive judiciary, and legislature executive. They are not always in tandem. They are not always in balanced position, right? This idea of separation of powers under Indian Constitution is famously known as the idea of checks and balances. So these organs continuously, every now and then, these organs try and exercise some sort of check on each other, thereby keeping, or ensuring the constitutional value balance is maintained while the governance is going on. So to maintain governance in a balanced state of affairs, right, to maintain democracy in balanced state of affairs, you'll find that these three organs are basically responsible, and they have been under Indian Constitution given such powers. So any dispute that arises out of functioning of these organs or otherwise also are taken care of by some sort of dispute redressal mechanism. Of course, now under dispute redressal mechanism, we can, if we try and stretch it, a little bit more, we can talk about tribunals, we can talk about some constitutional bodies, like for example, interstate council, or for that matter, under 262 of the Constitution, we have Parliament creating a body for resolving water disputes and etc. Or for that matter, under 307 of the Constitution, we have the provision of the Constitution says that any issue arising out of freedom of trade and commerce and intercourse throughout the territory of India to be resolved by new such body, which would be created or established by the Parliament. So these such bodies are created, some of them by the Constitution and others, by parliamentary law or otherwise. When we are talking about dispute redressal mechanism, we need to consider all these bodies, right, while we are studying or while we are preparing the material on the same, right? And accordingly, of course, we have to go back to the previous year question papers to get hold over what type of questions are they asking, what different aspects or different points, UPSC is considering while asking those questions. Similarly, this term called as institutions also is a part of dispute redressal mechanism, or various organs or maybe institutions which would ensure separation of power remains intact. For example, Election Commission of India, which is recently in news, right? Apart from that, we have CAG, Comptroller and Auditor General of India. We also have Finance Commission of India. These are some of the constitutional agencies. Similarly, we have Union Public Service Commission, which is also constitutional agency or institution. On similar lines, we can definitely talk about some other constitutional and statutory agencies or institutions which maintain this structure intact, and they keep working in the same direction, right? So that is in brief about this particular slide. We should now move to the next point, or maybe next slide. So here we have now the part of legislature, parliament and state legislature. What UPSC expects us, again, under this particular point or this particular topic is preparing, structure, as you can see here, functioning, right, conduct of business, and powers and privileges arising out of, or issues arising out of powers and privileges of members of the parliament or members of the state legislature. So overall, when we look at these points, what we need to understand is we need to prepare or understand basics of Indian Parliament, then basics of state legislature in India, right? And apart from that, once we are done with that, the basics are done, then we need to understand like structure, right? Then how it functions and what are its functions. What and how are very important points to be considered here, you know. So functions, then conduct of business, right? So conduct of business means what? How exactly are proceedings on the legislature of the state or maybe in that of in the parliament are conducted. Like for example, one of the most famous examples or maybe issue that I can cite here is issue of one of the famous issue that I can, or maybe one of the important issues that I can cite here is of anti-defection law and anti-defection proceedings, you know. And anti-defection proceedings takes place in state legislature and in parliament, and speaker in both houses, that is in Lok Sabha and in state legislative assembly, are considered to be office that will take decisions on anti-defection. So when it comes to conduct of business, right, one needs to understand, one needs to keep in mind that conduct of business of or in parliament and conduct of business in state legislature. So to understand this, right, we need to understand different rules of different provisions of Indian Constitution, as well as different rules of procedure which apply to the conduct of business. You must be knowing some of the MLAs and MPs, you know, have been removed from parliament. They have been their membership have been suspended from the parliament, and that was on the account of the fact that they have probably breached some of the privileges. They have probably breached some of the privileges and didn't follow some of the procedures of the parliament, and that amounts to, you know, their removal. So the next point in our discussion should be powers and privileges and issues arising out of that. So what powers and privileges these members of the parliament and state legislature enjoy? Now you need to understand that, for example, if we just for the sake of example, if we take an example of Article 105 Clause 1, you'll find that 105 talks about powers and privilege of members of parliament. That is, they have, under this constitution, subject to the provisions of the constitution, they have power or they have freedom of speech on the floor of the house. That in a way is a privilege that is enjoyed by members of the parliament. Now, what if they misuse the privilege? If they misuse the privilege, some issues will come out of it. And the misuse of such privileges is to be immediately taken care of by the concerned authority, and authority here is going to be speaker or chairman of the concerned house. So, the point that I am making here is, when we talk about parliament and state legislature, apart from their structure, apart from their functioning, we also need to go to the further or maybe next level, right, wherein we are going into details of actual conduct of business, where we are going into details of, you know, different privileges and powers of members of parliament and parliament as a whole. So to understand these 2 points, I think one needs to go beyond ordinarily prescribed books, and one needs to take care, or maybe one needs to keep an eye on, you know, newspapers, right, along with some good news articles. So that is what is expected here. Now, after this, what is next point in syllabus? Let's look at that. So the next point that we are going to come across is structure, organization and functioning of executive, judiciary and different ministries and departments of the government of India. So as we, in previous slide, as we talked about structure, functioning and conduct of business of Lok Sabha, conduct of business of Rajya Sabha, conduct of business of state legislative assemblies, in similar manner, structure, organization and functioning of their, in previous slide we talked about legislature. Here we need to prepare for executive in similar manner. We need to prepare for judiciary in similar manner. Not just that, but in case of executive, your syllabus goes on to prescribe furthermore few more details. It talks about, or it expects us to prepare on different ministries of government of India, right, or for that matter even government of states, and different departments and ministries of central government. Now why it is expected that we should know about different ministries and departments of government of India? Obviously, because you are going to be one of the you are preparing for an exam through which one of the permanent executives would be selected, right? And so you must know about executive system in detail. So the ministries and departments and their functioning and the way powers and different responsibilities are allocated or distributed amongst these ministries, you must know about it, and you must have a very good understanding about issues which may arise out of, or issues pertaining to, distribution of business of the government amongst different ministries and different departments. Rules concerning the same, it is President of India which prescribes the rules for how the departments and ministries should function and what grounds and etc. So under rule making power of the President of India, these two things are managed, or you can say, these two things are basically managed. So that is about executive, judiciary, and previous slide we talked about legislature, right? Now we will talk about, apart from executive, legislature and judiciary, what we have here for our discussion is role in polity of pressure groups, formal and informal associations. Now, this particular part is a part of different governing institutions, right? And polity and developmental processes. So what do you mean by pressure groups, and why UPSC expects us to prepare on this? I would rather switch to next part, and then we will come back to this particular slide and I will explain you this particular part also. So let's first go into details of constitutional posts and constitutional bodies. Here, as we talked about legislature, executive, judiciary, now we have different constitutional posts and constitutional bodies. For example, so we have, you all must be knowing about Election Commission, then we have CAG, we have Finance Commission, as I said, then we have UPSC, right, etc., etc. So such bodies are created. Some of these bodies are created by the Constitution or provided for in the Constitution. There are other bodies also which are referred to as statutory regulatory bodies. Let's take example of those bodies also. So we have RBI, then IRDA, right, Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority. You must be knowing about SEBI, right? So these bodies, Securities and Exchange Board of India. So these bodies are basically statutory bodies. Statutory bodies are basically bodies which are created by some or other law. Statute is nothing but law, right? So we have to, apart from constitutional agencies or constitutional bodies, we have to also prepare, some important statutory bodies as well, right? And that is very crucial here. UPSC keeps asking questions on statutory and regulatory bodies, right? Apart from that, you must also be knowing about some of the quasi-judicial bodies. Now, what do you mean by quasi-judicial bodies? Partially judicial bodies. You must have definitely heard about tribunals. So we had Water Dispute Tribunal, right? You might have heard about this, right? Or for that matter, quasi-judicial bodies, any tribunal, National Green Tribunal, you probably also might have heard about. A company law tribunal, etc., etc. So when we talk about these tribunals, these are basically quasi-judicial bodies, partially judicial bodies, which we need to prepare under our syllabus. For example, if we take an example, what do you need to prepare on in case of these constitutional and such bodies? Basically, you need to work on, you need to prepare for their appointment, how the CAG is appointed, what are terms and conditions of CAG's office, right? Then what are powers of CAG, or Comptroller Auditor General of India, right? And UPSC has been consistently, in almost every year, been asking question on either constitutional or statutory bodies or regulatory bodies or quasi-judicial bodies every single year, right? And they ask those questions very interestingly. The question which I remember here and I can cite here for your convenience is, they asked about how the terms and conditions of the CAG's office reflect, the CAG's office, the institution of CAG, is significant in Indian democracy, and how the terms and conditions of CAG's office reflects the same. Now, they asked you about functions and responsibilities of CAG, terms and conditions of appointment, and terms and conditions of service conditions of the CAG, but they linked that with, CAG being a significant significant office, and you were expected to prove how the appointment process or powers, functions and responsibilities of that said office, CAG's office, are significant for democracy. So what UPSC expects is not just general understanding or, not just fundamental understanding of these institutions. I mean to say, just by hearting things from some or other popular book won't help us. You need to prepare, of course, basics, and you need to link basics with, or maybe you need to apply basics, in today's context, and accordingly you may come across question in mains, and then you will have to answer the same. So that is about these statutory and constitutional bodies which we need to prepare for, right? So now, friends, we will now switch to the next part of our syllabus, wherein we have the topic is development processes and industry. So this particular point, development processes and industries, is now next set of syllabus, or maybe next important aspect in our syllabus. Now, when we talk about this, right, here UPSC makes a very interesting mention that development process. So it is not asking, or like it is not, of course it is expected that you must know about what do you mean by development, basic concepts or maybe basic definition, of course, but it talks about processes, development processes. Now one may simply focus on, reading about NGOs and self-help groups and donors, charitable trust and such institutions, and may not necessarily link this word processes with complete syllabus of UPSC paper second. So when we are talking about development processes, right, one needs to understand the term development, or maybe development, is carried out, by major players in development. What are these major players in development? For example, we have government. So rather I should say here that we have state. Then we have private sector. This can also be called as public sector, right? Then we have private sector, right? Then apart from these two, we next have in list is civil society. So civil society, private sector and government, state or public sector. So public, private and voluntary sector, if you want to say, right? In this fashion, or maybe these are three important stakeholders, you can say, in development process. Now, what do you mean by process? So here syllabus basically says that these three major stakeholders or sectors in development, they continuously keep working towards furthering the ideals or goals of development, achieving the targets, right? But then the civil society organizations would try and question private and maybe public, and they also assist public and private whenever it comes to their role in development. I should cite an example here, and that is of recent matter which was heard by Supreme Court, and that is of electoral bonds, right? Some civil society agencies found that the electoral bond policy had some lacunas, and so they went on to file the matter in the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court ultimately brought it to the notice of the public at large that there was some Supreme Court declared it to be unconstitutional. A policy as a whole was declared as unconstitutional, and people got to know that the funding that was given to different political parties had some issues, or it was a sort of a quid pro quo, if you can manage to understand this term, so that Supreme Court tried to indicate. So basically, when it comes to processes, these three organs of the state would play a role in, development process. So now, out of these three organs which I listed, or which we talked about, out of these three organs, here under development processes, we will be talking about, or you are supposed to prepare on NGOs, self-help groups, various groups and associations. Then we have donors and charitable trusts, institutional and other stakeholders. Now these all of these, are agencies of voluntary sector, or you can call it as civil society. Right? So these are the players of this larger domain, or maybe larger sector, called as civil society sector or voluntary sector. So now, as I said, these bodies, NGOs and self-help groups, etc., they are part of voluntary sector. Now what we need to do is, we need to prepare these bodies in the form of what role do they play, like what role NGO plays or self-help group plays in process of development. What are various groups and associations which contribute in the process of development. You must definitely be knowing about donors and charitable trust and charitable institutions. They do great deal of work in support of vulnerable sections, for upliftment of vulnerable sections. So, for example, if we talk about one of the famous examples for that matter is of midday meal scheme. The scheme is basically initiated by Government of India, and under that scheme, now we have Akshay Patra, an NGO, which is working for supporting that scheme, for running that scheme, right? And then Akshay Patra gets number of donations, to run the scheme. The donors are privates, as well as you will find that the central government also gives money, government also gives money to Akshay Patra for running the scheme. So when we look at these agencies from civil society organizations, you will find that these agencies play a critical role, on multiple platforms. Like, for example, for making these development processes more enriched, more better, right, and well developed. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that when it comes to assisting, assisting Government of India, or maybe that of Government of State for that matter, right? When it comes to bringing transparency, when it comes to holding government and government agencies accountable, right? When it comes to unearthing the scams and etc., you will find that these bodies keep continuously, these bodies are engaged, particularly NGOs here, they are engaged in bringing these or protecting these important values of democratic development. Apart from that, when we talk about self-help groups, these are small groups of people, those who collectively work for their betterment. Most of these are organized on the lines of or on the basis of their economic strength. So they come together, they pool the resources together, and out of that resource they start functioning, or they run a particular business, or maybe economic activity, which works as support for their families. So that is an example, like that's how the self-help groups work. So this self-help group basically helps in redistributive justice, right? It helps in distributing the profit among different sections of society, or maybe helping them to engage into active economic platforms, and then that helps them earn their bread and butter. In similar manners, various organizations and associations, etc., will find these agencies keep working for development processes. So the term industry is basically nothing but these things. So development industry includes what? Development industry includes public, private, and voluntary sector. So all these three sectors and the different players in these sectors, they are all part and parcel of this development process and development industry. So now, next slide, wherein if you can see the title, the syllabus says that vulnerable sections. Now, in previous slide, we said that different stakeholders in development processes, right? We also talked about, in one of the slides, there was a point of pressure groups and agencies, right? These pressure groups, different stakeholders, as we saw in previous slide, different stakeholders in development process, most of them are going to be most of them are going to be vulnerable sections. The whole process of development ideally aims at uplifting the vulnerable sections of society, helping them cope up with or helping them to come into mainstream. So what we need to understand here under this topic is we need to prepare for different welfare schemes of central government and state government. I just gave you an example of midday meal. We can also talk about, there are multiple, almost all flagship schemes of the central government and state governments are basically aimed at upliftment of vulnerable sections, right? Or doing away with vulnerabilities of different sections of Indian society and helping them come into mainstream and, ensuring that the benefits of development process or governance reach to their doorsteps also. So we need to also prepare for these welfare schemes, like for that matter, who are these vulnerables, right? What do you mean by vulnerable sections and who are they? So basically we can talk about women, we can talk about children, we can talk about aged population in India, we can talk about tribals, we can talk about SCs and STs and OBCs, right? Accordingly, or maybe economically vulnerable and beggars and etc. They are all, there can be different reasons which may impart, or maybe different factors which may impart vulnerability to particular section of society, right? So doing away with those factors or trying to eradicate those factors which impart that vulnerability to different sections, right? State, that is center, I mean to say like center and state government, right, comes up with different schemes, right? Different laws. For example, when we talk about welfare schemes by center and state government, I gave you an example of midday meal, or for that matter, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, or in similar manner, we can take many more such examples. Do we have any laws for that matter? So I gave an example of women as a vulnerable group. So Domestic Violence Act is a act which is, passed by the central government, parliament, to protect the women, In similar manner, you must also be knowing about Prohibition of Manual Scavenging Act, right? So manual scavengers, because of their economic and social status, may be unwillingly forced to work into conditions which are not human, right? And to address such issues, then we have some laws which are passed by the parliament, or maybe we may also have some laws which are passed by respective state governments. So we need to prepare those laws, and not just that, we need to know, of course not all, but the laws and the policies of the government which are in news, we need to prepare them for that particular year, right? And how basically. So we need to prepare, we need to focus on that, and we need to judge the performance of those schemes and those laws. Are there any defects in laws, right? Are these laws being not misused, right? Or are they being very well implemented? Are there any mistakes or maybe loopholes in welfare policies of the government of India or government of state, right? And how have these policies performed over the period of time? So we need to talk about, or maybe we need to prepare for, performance of such schemes and such laws over the period of time, and then we need to understand their lacunas, and of course we need to suggest the improvements on the same. So we also have some bodies and institutions for protection and betterment of these vulnerable sections. So we can take an example of SC/ST Commission. We can also take an example of OBC Commission. In recent past, UPSC has also asked a question in mains on OBC Commission. So these are just few examples which I am citing here. So institutions and bodies for the protection and betterment of vulnerable sections also need to be studied thoroughly for, or maybe under this particular topic. We can also take an example of National Women Commission, which UPSC has also asked, and not just that, but we can also take an example of National Human Rights Commissions. Apart from that, the one more word that is there in the syllabus is about mechanism. What mechanisms do we have? That is institutional structure and their operation and their functioning. What mechanisms do we have which protects the vulnerable sections and guards their rights, or for that matter, helps them live a respectful life? So that we need to prepare for. Now, apart from that, in the vulnerable sections, basically we also need to focus on this part. Now what is this? The next slide talks about issues regarding development and management of health, again pertaining to vulnerable sections and otherwise also. Then development and management of education, then human resource, poverty and hunger, right? These, now see, if we look at these points, you will find that health, poverty, hunger can be studied in paper 3 also. How do we need to prepare here separately? So, this vulnerable, along with vulnerable sections, this part also deals with social justice. Now, the term social justice doesn't appear directly in any line of your syllabus. It is mentioned in the title of GS paper 2, social justice. Of course, now we need not necessarily apply social justice concept only to these sectors, right? It can be applied to all points in paper second except for IR, right? So what I'm trying to mention here is health sector, education sector, human resource, poverty and hunger. These are some of the points which we need to prepare here. We need to work on the health industry in India, health policy of Government of India, budget and budget related provisions pertaining to health, what improvements do we need to do, etc., etc. for health. We also need to do it same way, for education, development and management of education sector. You must be knowing about new education policy of Government of India. So we need to prepare that policy very well, thoroughly very well. What improvements do we need to bring in? So we need to work on that. You need to collect different reports of Government of India or different committees set up by regional governments as well as central government on education, health, and also on human resource and poverty and hunger. So under this particular topic also we need to prepare it from the point of view of vulnerable sections of society, and also otherwise, I mean to say, holistically we have to look at these points and link or maybe attach these points with rest of the part of our syllabus. So the next slide that we have is dealing with governance. Now in governance, your syllabus prescribes some important aspects of governance. So transparency, accountability, then it talks about citizens charter, it also talks about e-governance, right? It also talks about institutional and other measures for or in the topic called as governance. So basically here we need to talk about governance in general and good governance in particular. Right? All the steps taken by government and otherwise by civil society organizations or maybe by private sector, etc., to bring in more transparency in affairs of the governance, to bring in more accountability, right? For example, Right to Information Act. RTI is act passed by Government of India or maybe by Parliament of India, to bring in more transparency and accountability and give right to people to ask for what and how exactly the governance is being carried out, right? And this is an essential, or you can say one of the important developments which have taken place. And you must be knowing that there was a civil society organization which worked for RTI to become a reality. And so now today we have right to information. In similar manner, there is something called as citizen charter. It is a charter which lists down different services given by government or maybe different services given by a particular government office, and the list as well as responsible officers, the time taken for such services to be delivered, etc., is listed and very well displayed at the entry point itself in these government offices. Now what happens because of that? Now this helps us, a citizen, a common man, to understand what are the services given by the state or maybe that office, and what are the fees or maybe charges taken, which officer is to be contacted for, etc. So this citizen charter also brings in further transparency in the process of governance. In similar manner, when we look at e-governance applications, etc., models, and then its success and limitations and different potential. E-governance is a buzzword today. E-governance has become the next step in governance. Almost all functions of the government, which used to be carried out earlier, are now taken care of by, or through, you all must be knowing about information and communication technology, right? So this information and communication technology has helped governments across the globe to phenomenally change their processes and their way of conducting governance. So under this particular topic, we have to also prepare how has e-governance or how has information and communication technology helped us bring in new era in governance, what are its different models, what are its successes, limitations, and what potential it holds for future. You all know very well that we have already entered into the age of artificial intelligence. Now, in your syllabus, this particular point, e-governance and potential, etc., talks about the same thing. How would AI, that is artificial intelligence, bring some changes in governance? How are we going to witness, new governance models or maybe new governance trends or techniques in coming future? So you can expect that UPSC may, in due course of time, switch its attention to information technology as well as, from just e-governance to artificial intelligence, and how AI helps in governance. What new laws do we need to bring in to regulate AI, or for that matter artificial intelligence, etc., needs to be prepared in this manner. Institutional and other measures, of course, like for governance, what different institutions of governance have we established since independence? What new institutions are required? How are we going to bring in new institutions, etc.? That one needs to prepare under this particular topic. Economic offenses used to be a sort of a dreamed idea, right? Way back in 1950s and etc. And now PMLA becomes an important tool today for government to investigate economic offenses and thereby control such things. And for that, new institutional structure has been established. So basically, when we talk about governance, we have to look at it holistically. We have to understand, different players in governance, whether public, private, as well as voluntary sector. And not just that, apart from that, we also need to see how has technology contributed in bringing new era altogether in governance. Till date, we used to talk about e-governance. I'm sure that in coming times, we will be also focusing on governance with the help of AI, that is artificial intelligence. Then friends, lastly, we have one more point, and that is role of civil services in democracy, right? Under this point also, what we need to prepare or what we need to do is, the civil service is considered to be the steel frame, right? Civil service is considered as the backbone of India's democracy. It is considered as a backbone of governance in India. So we need to prepare the role of civil service in democracy. How has civil service contributed in upholding democracy? How has it contributed in running democracy, right? Just constitutional setup or statutory setup is not enough, right? Apart from that, its functioning, running that setup, or maybe running it through institutions, is an important task which is carried out successfully by civil services in India. And so we need to prepare for this particular topic, role of civil service in democracy, and particularly in today's era or in today's time, right? So briefly speaking, when we look at the complete syllabus, this is what it mentions. And of course, at the end, I should thank you all for listening to me carefully. So I have in very brief, I have explained about what GS Paper 2 syllabus is. This has been a brief introduction. For any further query pertaining to what resources needs to be studied, then how one needs to go back and look at previous year question papers, what one should understand and one should take out of it, right? For that, we may wait for the next video. We will definitely talk with you on that point also. Thank you so much.